The chime of crystal shattering against marble was a sound the staff of the Croft penthouse had come to know intimately. It was the sound of a baccarat glass, valued at $400, meeting its end. It was the third such casualty that morning, a new record even for 10-year-old Lillian Croft. Lillian, sole heiress to the Julian Croft tech fortune, was not merely a difficult child. She was a force of nature, a meticulously curated storm in a Burberry dress. She had driven a former Special Forces colonel, hired for his disciplinary skills, to quit via a tearful text message. She had confounded a team of child psychologists from Stanford who concluded she was a cognitive labyrinth of unprecedented hostility. The tabloids, in their cruel, catchy way, had dubbed her the Billionaire's bane. Her father, Julian Croft, a man who could bend global markets to his will with a single phone call, was a man utterly broken by a 70-pound girl. He had built an empire on logic, on algorithms that predicted human behavior with terrifying accuracy. Yet, his own daughter was an unsolvable equation. He had exhausted every elite option, every pedigreed expert. All that was left was her, Amelia Hayes, a 24-year-old waitress from Queens, 3 months behind on her student loan payments, whose most recent crisis management experience involved a broken espresso machine during the lunch rush. She was about to be offered a job she was catastrophically unqualified for, and she was about to do the one thing that made her the only person for it. She was about to see the child, not the monster. The Gilded Spoon was not a place of glamour. It was a relic, a diner that had stubbornly refused to die, nestled in a corner of Manhattan that luxury had forgotten. Its vinyl booths were cracked like old leather, and the air hummed with the comforting scent of coffee and frying bacon. It served taxi drivers at dawn, office workers at noon, and the lonely at dusk. Amelia Amy Hayes knew its rhythms like her own heartbeat. At 24, she possessed a stillness that was unusual for her age. It wasn't apathy. It was a deep, practiced patience, honed over 6 years as the primary caregiver for her grandmother after a debilitating stroke. She had abandoned her final year of nursing school to learn a new language, the language of twitches and sighs, of the frustration that boiled in a mind trapped in a failing body. She learned to see the intent behind the outburst, the fear behind the fury. Her grandmother had passed a year ago, leaving Amy with a mountain of medical debt and a skill set that didn't appear on any resume. She was an observer. She noticed the slight tremor in Mr. Henderson's hand that meant his Parkinson's was worsening, prompting her to bring his coffee in a sturdier mug without being asked. She saw the exhaustion in a young mother's eyes and would quietly add a cookie to her child's plate on the house. Her life was a quiet tapestry of small kindnesses and looming bills. The name Julian Croft was, to her, a headline, a titan, the visionary behind Nexus, the operating system that ran nearly every smart device on the planet. He was a widower, his brilliant architect wife, Eleanor, having died in a tragic sailing accident 2 years prior. But the name Lillian Croft was whispered among the city's service class. Amy knew the stories because a former nanny for the Crofts, a young woman named Sarah, now worked weekends at the diner. "She's not a child, Amy. She's a poltergeist," Sarah had said just last week, her hands shaking as she refilled the salt shakers. "She doesn't just throw tantrums. She finds your weakness and dismantles you with it." She told one tutor his hair transplant was obvious. He cried. She told a chef his sauce was pedestrian, and then threw it at a Rothko painting. Croft is offering a king's ransom. No one will take it. It's a combat posting. It was a blustery Wednesday, the kind that drove tourists into museums and locals into diners, when the polished black door of the Gilded Spoon swung open. A man in a flawlessly tailored grey suit, the kind of suit that cost more than Amy's car, stepped in. He looked lost, a shark in a goldfish pond. Behind him, a small girl with dark, severe bangs and eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room, stood with an unnerving stillness. Amy recognized him instantly from magazine covers. Julian Croft looked less like a captain of industry and more like a man walking a tightrope over a canyon. The girl, Lillian, was his shadow, dressed in the dark green plaid of the elite Spence school. "A table," Julian said, his voice clipped and quiet. "Of course. Booth or table, sir?" Amy asked, grabbing 2 menus. "Booth in the corner, away from the window," Lillian commanded, her voice sharp and clear, devoid of any childish lilt. Amy led them to the quietest booth. The moment they sat, the audit began. "The fork has a water spot," Lillian stated, pointing a small accusatory finger. "The knife is misaligned by at least 3 degrees, and this napkin has been folded with an uneven crease." Julian sighed, a sound of profound, bottomless weariness. "Lily, please, not here." "Perfection is not a matter of location, Father. It is a principle," she retorted, not looking at him. She turned her laser-like focus on Amy. "The sugar dispenser is only 2/3 full. The salt shaker has condensation inside. This is an environment of unacceptable mediocrity." Amy looked at the items Lillian had catalogued. She was right about all of them. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a diagnosis. The girl wasn't lashing out. She was assessing, identifying failures in the system. It was the most bizarre, and in a strange way, the most brilliant display of distress Amy had ever witnessed. "I can bring you a new set of silverware, miss," Amy offered, her voice even. Lillian's eyes narrowed, surprised by the calm. "I require a full reset. The table must be wiped down again, with a clean cloth, in concentric circles, starting from the outside in. The condiments must be full and aligned to the table's edge. The menu should be presented without fingerprints." "Lily, that's enough," Julian snapped, his patience finally breaking. "Order a sandwich. I cannot consume food prepared in a place that demonstrates such a clear lack of discipline," Lillian said, her voice rising. "It suggests a similar lack of discipline in the kitchen. Cross-contamination. Unsanitary surfaces. Botulism." Amy watched Julian's face, a mask of controlled fury and public humiliation. She saw the other patrons starting to stare. Her manager, Sal, was already moving toward the table, his face grim. This was the moment of explosion. Instead, Amy leaned in slightly, her voice low. "You have an exceptional eye for detail, miss." Lillian and Julian both froze. "The concentric circle method for cleaning is interesting," Amy continued, as if they were discussing a scientific theory. "Does that provide more even coverage?" Lillian was momentarily speechless. This was not in the script. People were supposed to get angry, flustered, or condescendingly sweet. They were not supposed to engage with the substance of her critique. "It prevents streaking," Lillian finally managed, looking confused. "That makes sense," Amy said, nodding. She then turned to Julian. "Sir, with your permission, I can reset the table to the young lady's specifications. It will take me about 90 seconds. Julian Croft stared at Amy, as if she had just started speaking fluent Martian. He looked at his daughter, who was watching Amy with a look of intense, analytical curiosity. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Amy worked with quiet efficiency. She brought a new set of silverware, polished to a gleam. She wiped the table in the requested pattern. She aligned the condiments perfectly. She presented a clean menu. "Is this acceptable?" Amy asked Lillian. Lillian inspected the table. She ran a finger along the edge. She picked up the fork, holding it up to the light. A long, tense silence stretched. It is adequate, she conceded. I'll take that as a win, Amy smiled faintly. Now, what can I get for you? Lillian ordered a glass of water with no ice and a toasted cheese sandwich, but with a list of specifications so precise it sounded like a chemical formula. The bread must be white, toasted to a Pantone shade 7506C. The cheese American, melted but not browned. It must be cut on a perfect diagonal. Any deviation in the 45-degree angle will be unacceptable. Got it, Amy said, writing it down without a flicker of expression. And for you, sir? Just coffee, Julian murmured, his eyes never leaving Amy. 10 minutes later, Amy returned. She placed the water before Lillian. Then, with the care of a bomb disposal expert, she set down the plate. The sandwich was a masterpiece of geometric precision. The toast was a uniform, pale gold. The cut was a perfect, crisp diagonal. Lillian stared at it. She picked up half the sandwich. She examined the crust, the cheese, the angle of the cut. The entire diner seemed to be holding its breath. She lowered the sandwich. Then, with a motion so swift and violent it was a blur, she slammed her open palm down on the glass of water. It didn't just tip over. It exploded. Water and shards of glass erupted across the table, drenching the perfect sandwich, the front of Julian's suit, and Lillian herself. The gilded spoon fell into a tomb-like silence. The surface tension was compromised by a microscopic flaw in the rim of the glass, Lillian announced to the silent room, her voice trembling with a strange, righteous fury. An impurity, it was inevitable. Julian Croft slumped in his seat, the fight completely gone out of him. He buried his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the table. "God, I'm so sorry." Sal, the manager, was already rushing over, his face a mottled red. "Mr. Croft, Amy, get the—" But Amy wasn't looking at her manager or the billionaire. She was looking at Lillian, at the tiny, trembling hands clenched into fists on the girl's lap. She didn't see a monster. She saw her grandmother, a brilliant engineer, trapped in her own home, raging at a misplaced book or a crooked picture frame because it was the only thing in her chaotic world she could still control. Amy picked up a clean napkin. She didn't start mopping up the large puddle. She carefully picked up a single, large shard of glass from the table. She held it up. Julian was already fumbling for his wallet, the thick black gleam of his Centurion card emerging. "I'll pay for everything, everyone's meal, the damages. Just send me a bill." "It was flawed," Lillian repeated, her voice smaller now, the adrenaline of the explosion fading into a quiet, defensive tremor. Amy ignored the credit card. She ignored Sal. She held the piece of glass toward Lillian. "You're right," Amy said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Look at the edge here. You can see where the glass is slightly thicker. It's a manufacturing defect. It would have failed under pressure eventually." Lillian's head shot up. Her mouth fell open slightly. Of all the reactions she had ever engineered, fear, anger, pity, frustration, simple, factual validation was the one she had never encountered. "But I have a question," Amy continued, her voice still quiet and calm. She leaned against the edge of the booth, creating a small, private space for the three of them amidst the public disaster. "The palm strike method. Is that for maximum energy transfer?" Julian lifted his head from his hands, his expression one of utter disbelief. Sal looked as if his brain had blue-screened. Lillian blinked. "It focuses the kinetic force onto a single point," she said, her voice a near whisper. "A finger poke would dissipate the energy. A fist would risk cutting the knuckles. It's the most efficient application of force." "Efficient," Amy repeated, nodding thoughtfully as she began to gather the other glass fragments. But messy. The splash radius was significant. You soaked your father's suit and the primary objective, the sandwich. A tiny, almost imperceptible spark of something, not a smile but interest, flickered in Lillian's eyes. Collateral damage is sometimes unavoidable. True, Amy conceded, now wiping down the table. But a superior strategist seeks to minimize it. You could have achieved the same result, proving the glass was flawed, by simply pointing it out. This was a statement. A bit loud, don't you think? For such a smart observation. "Shut up," Lillian muttered, but the usual venom was absent. It was a reflexive response, not a hostile one. "I'm serious," Amy said, her work done. "All that energy and for what? A wet table and a ruined lunch. Seems inefficient. Now, are you still hungry, or was the experiment concluded?" "I'm not hungry." "Okay. Then you'll have to sit here while your father drinks his coffee, which I will now replace." Amy moved away, calm and methodical. She brought Julian a fresh coffee and a dry cloth for his suit. She didn't coddle, she didn't scold, she didn't apologize. She had treated Lillian's outburst not as a tantrum, but as a flawed scientific demonstration, and in doing so, had disarmed her completely. For the first time since they had walked in, Lillian Croft was silent. She didn't complain about the draft from the door or the hum of the refrigerator. She just sat there, watching Amy move through the diner, her expression one of profound and utter bewilderment. Julian drank his coffee. He paid the bill, leaving a tip so large it made Sal's eyes water, and stood up. "Thank you," he said to Amy, his voice hoarse with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "It's my job," she replied simply. As they walked to the door, Lillian looked back over her shoulder. Her dark eyes met Amy's. Amy gave her a small, non-committal shrug. Lillian didn't smile, but for the first time, she didn't look like a tiny soldier bracing for impact. She just looked like a child. An hour later, as Amy was wiping down the counter at the end of her shift, Sal called her into his small, cluttered office. "I don't know what you did, kid," he said, rubbing his temples. "It was like watching a bomb diffuser talk down a psychopath. I thought I was going to have a heart attack." He shook his head. "Anyway, Julian Croft's personal assistant called. She wants you to call this number. Immediately." He handed her a slip of paper. It felt less like a phone number and more like a court summons. A cold knot formed in Amy's stomach. She was either about to be sued into oblivion or offered a ticket to a world she couldn't possibly navigate. She wasn't sure which was worse. That evening, sitting on her lumpy sofa in her cramped Queen's apartment, she made the call. "Miss Hayes," a crisp, professional voice said, "Mr. Croft would like to see you. His car will be at your address in 1 hour." It was not a request. The car was a black Maybach, a silent, hulking beast of German engineering that made her entire apartment building look shabby. As she slid onto the buttery leather seat, she felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were an actress who had wandered onto the wrong set. The Croft Industries tower was a blade of obsidian and light that scraped the sky over Midtown. Amy was led not to an office, but to a private elevator that opened directly into Julian Croft's penthouse apartment. The space was immense, a gallery of glass, steel, and stark white walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Central Park, a dark, rectangular void dotted with necklace-like strings of light. The air was still and sterile, like a museum after hours. Julian Croft stood by the window, a silhouette against the city. In his own territory, the exhaustion was gone, replaced by an aura of formidable power. "Miss Hayes, thank you for coming." You didn't really give me a choice, Amy said, her voice steadier than she felt. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. No, I suppose I didn't. Please sit. She sat on a white sofa that felt more like a sculpture than a piece of furniture. I'll be direct, he said, turning to face her. What I saw today. No one has ever done that. They placate her, they fight her, they ignore her, or they break. You engaged her. I was just doing my job, Mr. Croft. No, you were doing something else. You didn't see a spoiled brat. You saw something else. What was it? Amy thought for a moment, remembering her grandmother's fierce, frustrated intelligence. I saw someone who is desperately trying to control an environment that feels completely out of her control, and who is far too smart for her own good. Julian nodded slowly, a flicker of pain in his eyes. Her mother, Eleanor, she was the same. A brilliant architect. Everything had to be perfect, precise. She saw the world in lines and angles. Since she died, Lillian, it's like she's trying to hold the world to my wife's standards, and it keeps failing her. He walked to a massive, polished desk. She has been through 9 governesses in 2 years, 4 behavioral therapists. She's been expelled from 2 of the finest schools in the country. I am a man who manages global supply chains and billion-dollar mergers, but I cannot reach my own daughter. The raw vulnerability was back, made more poignant by the immense power surrounding him. Mr. Croft, I'm a waitress. I have 3 semesters of nursing school. I'm not qualified for whatever this is. The qualified have all failed, he said, his voice hard. They come with their doctorates and their methodologies, and she fillets them in an hour. They see a problem to be managed. You saw a person to be understood. You didn't try to stop her. You tried to understand her. He turned, his gaze intense. I want to hire you, Miss Hayes. Not as a nanny or a tutor. I don't know what the hell to call it. A companion. An interpreter. I want you to spend time with her. After school, weekends. I want you to do what you did today. Amy's mind was a whirlwind. I can't. I have my job, my classes. I will pay you, Julian interrupted. $500,000 a year. Amy physically flinched. The number was so vast it felt violent. It was an escape velocity number. It was the end of debt, the end of her cramped apartment, the end of the fear that gnawed at the edges of her life. Furthermore, he continued, pressing his advantage, I will fund the completion of your nursing degree, and your master's, should you choose to pursue it, at any institution you wish. This had to be a dream, a cruel, elaborate joke. Why? She whispered. Why me? Because you weren't afraid of her, and because when she shattered that glass, you were the only person in the room who looked at her and didn't see a monster. Before Amy could process this, a cool, feminine voice cut through the air. Julian, you cannot possibly be entertaining this folly. A woman emerged from an adjoining room. She was tall and impossibly elegant, with silver blonde hair swept into a severe chignon. She wore a simple navy dress that screamed couture. She appraised Amy with the dismissive air of a queen examining a scullery maid. This is a child, not a broken appliance. You don't just hire the first person who can jiggle the handle and make it stop rattling for a moment. Caroline, this is not your concern, Julian said, his voice hardening. Lillian is my niece. Her well-being is entirely my concern. The woman, Caroline Croft, snapped. She turned her icy blue eyes on Amy. You serve coffee for a living. What specialized training do you possess that makes you think you can handle a child with Lillian's complexities? She knows how to clean up a mess, Caroline, Julian warned. No, Amy said, finding her voice. She stood up, her worn sneakers feeling ridiculous on the plush white rug. "You're right, Miss Croft. I'm not qualified. I don't have a fancy degree, and I don't know anything about this world." She gestured around the vast, empty room. "But I also know that all your qualified people have failed. They came in here trying to impress you," she looked at Julian, "or trying to fix her. I'm not interested in either." Julian and Caroline both looked at her, stunned. "If I take this job," Amy continued, a sudden, unexpected courage surging through her, "I have conditions." Caroline let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Conditions? My dear girl, you are in no position to—" "What are they?" Julian cut her off, his eyes fixed on Amy. "One," Amy said, her heart hammering. "I'm not a governess. I don't enforce schedules or discipline. I'm not her servant. I'm here to be a buffer, a translator. Nothing more." "Fine," Julian said. "Two," she said, turning to Caroline. "You stay away, from me and from Lillian when I'm with her. Your concern feels more like pressure, and that's the last thing she needs." Caroline's face became a mask of aristocratic fury. "How dare you? Julian, this is preposterous." "Caroline, I am handling this. Please," Julian said, his voice leaving no room for argument. She shot Amy a look of pure venom and swept out of the room. "And three?" Julian asked, turning back to Amy. "Three?" Amy said, taking a deep breath. "You have to be here. I am not a substitute for her father. If I tell you she needs you, you come home. No meetings, no excuses. Your money can't buy you out of being her dad. Otherwise, there's no point." Julian Croft, the man who moved markets and built empires, looked at the 24-year-old waitress who was making demands of him. And for the second time that day, he was completely surprised. A slow, tired but genuine smile spread across his face. "When can you start?" The first week was a war of attrition, fought in near silence. Lillian treated Amy's presence as an irritating but irrelevant change in the atmospheric pressure. She would not speak to her directly, instead addressing her through the household staff. "Consuela, inform Miss Hayes that her shoes are scuffing the floor," she would say, while Amy was standing 3 feet away. "Miss Hayes, I am informed that my shoes are scuffing the floor," Amy would reply to the housekeeper, who would look helplessly between them. Amy didn't push. She simply existed in Lillian's orbit. She read her nursing textbooks in the cavernous living room while Lillian did her homework. She accompanied the driver to pick Lillian up from school, sitting in the front seat and saying nothing. She was a quiet, constant presence, and her refusal to be provoked was, in itself, a provocation. Lillian was used to getting a reaction. Amy gave her nothing but calm persistence. The breakthrough, when it came, was over a blueprint. Amy was in the library, a 2-story room lined with books that looked untouched when she saw Lillian at a large table. Spread before her was not homework, but a complex architectural drawing. Lillian was staring at it, her small face tight with concentration. She held a pencil, but her hand was trembling. "What's that?" Amy asked gently, approaching the table. Lillian flinched, quickly trying to cover the drawing with her arms. "It's nothing. It's private." "It looks like a house," Amy observed, seeing the intricate lines, the call-outs for materials, the detailed elevations. "A very complicated one." "It was my mother's," Lillian said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was the last thing she was working on. A house for us. In Maine." Amy looked closer. The design was beautiful, a stunning blend of glass and wood that seemed to grow out of a rocky coastline. But she also noticed something else. Several areas were marked with faint, erased pencil lines, as if someone had tried and failed to complete them. She never finished it, Lillian said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The guest wing. The roof pitch is wrong. It's not structurally sound." "How do you know?" Amy asked, genuinely curious. "Because I've run the calculations. The load-bearing points are incorrectly distributed. It would collapse under heavy snow," Lillian said, the words sounding absurd coming from a 10-year-old. She would have seen it. She would have fixed it. But she didn't get to. She looked down at the blueprint, her shoulders slumping. "It's imperfect, and I don't know how to fix it." In that moment, Amy understood. This wasn't about a house. It was about a flaw in the universe, a problem left unsolved by the one person Lillian considered perfect. Her mother's death wasn't just a loss. It was an error in the grand design, and Lillian, her mother's daughter, felt a desperate, impossible responsibility to correct it. "Maybe," Amy said softly, "it doesn't need to be fixed. Maybe it just needs to be remembered." "No!" Lillian snapped, her grief instantly turning to anger. "It has to be perfect. She was perfect." This was the core of it, the crushing weight of an idealized memory. Amy knew she was treading on sacred ground. "No one is perfect, Lily," she said, using the shortened name for the first time. "Your mum was brilliant, I'm sure, but she was a person. People make mistakes. They erase lines. They get the math wrong sometimes. That's part of the process." "Not her," Lillian insisted, her eyes flashing. "You didn't know her. You know nothing." She began frantically rolling up the blueprint, her movements clumsy with emotion. "Get out! Leave me alone!" She fled the room, leaving Amy standing alone with the ghost of an unfinished house. The incident with the blueprint created a hairline fracture in Lillian's armor. She was still distant, but the hostility was now tinged with a grudging respect. Amy had seen her secret, the source of her obsessive need for perfection, and she hadn't recoiled or tried to placate her. She had talked to her like an equal. Meanwhile, Caroline Croft was playing a longer, more subtle game. She couldn't get Amy fired through direct confrontation, so she resorted to sabotage. She would visit the penthouse under the guise of seeing her brother, and in her wake, chaos would bloom. A rare, first edition book in the library would be found with a faint coffee ring on its cover. A priceless vase would be shifted a few inches to the left. Small, almost unnoticeable imperfections that would send Lillian into a tailspin of anxiety and rage, always occurring shortly after Amy had been in the room. "She's framing me," Amy told Julian one evening, after Lillian had a complete meltdown because the silk curtains in her bedroom were hanging half an inch unevenly. Julian, tired from a long day, rubbed his eyes. "Amy, Caroline is difficult, but she wouldn't do that. She loves Lillian." "She loves the idea of Lillian," Amy corrected. "She's trying to prove that I can't handle her, that you can't handle her without her help." Julian was skeptical. His sister was manipulative, yes, but this seemed too cruel, too calculated. His loyalty was divided, and his exhaustion made it easier to believe in accidents than in conspiracy. Amy realized she was on her own. She had to find a way to prove it. Her chance came during the annual Croft Foundation Gala, a lavish affair held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Julian insisted that Lillian make an appearance. Lillian, in turn, insisted that Amy come with her. The event was a glittering spectacle of wealth and power. Lillian, dressed in a custom Oscar de la Renta dress, was a small, rigid island of misery in a sea of champagne and air kisses. Caroline was in her element, gliding through the crowd like a silver shark. "Lillian, darling," Caroline cooed, approaching them. "You look divine. But isn't your necklace clasp a bit crooked?" She reached out, her fingers brushing Lillian's neck. Lillian flinched violently away. "Don't touch me," she hissed. Caroline feigned a wounded look. My. It seems our little waitress hasn't been teaching you any manners." She gave Amy a triumphant smirk and drifted away. Later in the evening, as they were preparing to leave, Lillian began to panic. "My earring," she gasped, her hand flying to her left ear. "It's gone." It was a small, diamond stud, one of a pair that had belonged to her mother. A frantic search began. Julian was called. Museum security was alerted. Lillian grew more and more distraught, her breathing shallow and fast. "It was here," she sobbed. "I know it was." Amy knelt in front of her. "Okay, Lily. Breathe with me. When did you last feel it?" "I don't know. When Aunt Caroline, when she touched my neck. I think it was there then." An alarm bell went off in Amy's head. She scanned the area, her eyes tracing the path Carolyn had taken after speaking with them. She saw her, standing near a large marble statue, talking to a senator. As Amy watched, Caroline subtly opened her evening bag to check her phone. For a split second, the light caught something small and glittering inside. It was the earring. Amy's blood ran cold. Caroline hadn't just knocked it off. She had taken it. She had manufactured a crisis to publicly humiliate Lillian, and by extension, Amy. Amy knew a direct accusation was useless. It would be her word, the waitress's, against Caroline Croft's. She needed proof. She looked at Lillian, whose face was pale with panic. She had to end this now. "Lily," Amy said, her voice low and urgent, "I need you to trust me. I need you to do exactly as I say." She whispered her plan. Lillian's eyes widened, first in fear, then with a dawning, fierce intelligence. She nodded. Amy stood up and approached Julian, who was deep in a stressed conversation with the head of security. "Mr. Croft," she said calmly, "I think I know where it is, but we have to be careful. Can you please have security quietly lock down the exits? Tell them it's a precaution, nothing more." Julian, desperate, agreed. Then Amy and Lillian walked calmly and deliberately toward Caroline. "Aunt Caroline," Lillian said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. We can't find my earring. I was wondering if you might have seen it." Caroline's face was a perfect mask of concern. "Oh, you poor dear. No, I haven't seen a thing. What a terrible thing to lose." "I'm just so worried," Lillian continued, her voice trembling slightly. "It was Mum's. Daddy is having security search everyone before they leave. I hope they find it." A flicker of something, not panic, but annoyance, crossed Caroline's face. A public search would be messy and time-consuming. "Well, I'm sure that won't be necessary," Caroline said smoothly. "Oh, but it is," Amy interjected, stepping forward. "In fact, I just spoke to the head of security. They've already started reviewing the security footage from this hall. They're zooming in on everyone you've spoken to since we arrived." This was a complete lie, but it was a plausible one. Caroline's mask did not slip, but Amy, watching her with the intensity she had learned at her grandmother's bedside, saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible muscle twitching just below her left eye. It was the same twitch Amy had seen when her grandmother was trying to hide the fact that she'd dropped something. It was a tell. "How ridiculous," Caroline scoffed. "Isn't it?" Amy agreed pleasantly. "But you know how these high-definition cameras are. They pick up every detail. A reflection in a wine glass, the light catching on a piece of jewelry, even one tucked away in an evening bag." The muscle twitched again, more violently this time. "This is absurd," Caroline said, her voice a fraction too sharp. "Julian, call this off. You're making a scene." She turned to leave, but Julian, who had approached, drawn by the confrontation, now stood in her way. He had seen the look on his sister's face, had heard the slight tremor in her voice. For the first time, a seed of doubt about her was planted in his mind. "What's in your bag, Caroline?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Don't be ridiculous, Julian. My phone, my lipstick. Show me." It was a standoff. The senator and other nearby guests had fallen silent, watching the family drama unfold. Caroline was trapped. To refuse would be an admission of guilt. To open the bag would be to reveal the truth. With a look of pure hatred directed at Amy, Caroline slowly unclasped her bag. She tilted it, and with a soft clink, the diamond earring fell onto the marble floor. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Caroline tried to recover. "Oh my goodness, it must have fallen in when I hugged you, Lillian. How extraordinary." But no one was buying it. The lie was too thin, the malice in the air too thick. Julian stared at his sister, his face pale with a dawning, horrifying understanding. He saw the pattern, the small acts of sabotage, the constant undermining, the manufactured chaos, all culminating in this one public act of cruelty. He looked at Amy, who met his gaze with a steady, sad resolve. And he looked at his daughter, who was standing tall, her fear replaced by a cold, clear-eyed vindication. He didn't need security footage. He had seen the truth. The aftermath of the gala was a quiet earthquake that reshaped the Croft family. Caroline was banished. There was no public scandal, no dramatic confrontation replayed for the press. Julian handled it with the cold, silent efficiency he applied to his business dealings. Her name was removed from the foundation's board, her access to the penthouse revoked, her calls left unanswered. She became a non-person. For Julian, the revelation of his sister's treachery was a profound shock that forced him to reevaluate everything, especially his own role as a father. He had been outsourcing his daughter's grief, throwing money and experts at a problem that required only his time and attention. The process of rebuilding his relationship with Lillian was slow and awkward. At Amy's firm insistence, he began carving out protected time in his schedule. Lillian time, his calendar now read, for 2 hours every evening, and all day on Sundays. Their first few dinners were stilted, filled with long silences. He didn't know how to talk to his own child. "Ask her about the blueprint," Amy coached him before one dinner. "Don't try to solve it, just ask her to explain it to you." That night, Julian sat with Lillian in the library as she unrolled her mother's unfinished design. He listened as she explained the principles of cantilevered structures and the challenges of a variable roof pitch. He didn't understand half of it, but he saw the passion and intelligence in his daughter's eyes, a direct inheritance from his wife. He saw Eleanor in her, and for the first time since her death, the memory brought not just pain, but a flicker of pride. Amy's role shifted. She was less of a buffer and more of a bridge. She taught Julian how to listen, and she taught Lillian that it was safe to talk. She re-enrolled in her nursing program, attending classes during the day while Lillian was at school, her tuition paid in full as promised. One afternoon, she arrived at the penthouse to find it quiet. She found Lillian, not in the library, but in a room Amy had never seen before. It was a design studio, Eleanor's old workspace. It had been kept exactly as she had left it, a pristine, white space filled with drafting tables, models of buildings, and rolls of blueprints. It was a shrine to perfection. Lillian was standing before a large, intricate model of the house in Maine. Several small pieces of the roof lay on the table beside it. "I took it apart," Lillian said, without turning around. "The model. I wanted to see how she did it." "And Amy asked. She used glue, Lillian said, her voice full of wonder. Right here, on this joint. It's messy. You can see where it squeezed out the side. And this piece of balsa wood. It's cut at a slight angle. It's not perfect. She turned to look at Amy, her eyes wide with a revolutionary discovery. She made mistakes. It was a moment of profound liberation. The goddess was human. The weight of perfection Lillian had carried for 2 years finally began to lift. Yeah, Amy said, smiling. I guess she did. Just as a fragile peace began to settle over the penthouse, the final, most desperate attack came. A certified letter arrived from a prestigious law firm, addressed to Julian. It was a petition filed by Caroline Croft, seeking legal guardianship of Lillian. The document was a masterpiece of legal cruelty. It painted Julian as a negligent, emotionally distant father, unable to cope with his own grief and therefore unfit to raise his child. It detailed every one of Lillian's expulsions, every dismissed therapist, every public tantrum, and it painted Amy as a manipulative, unqualified interloper who had somehow wormed her way into the family's confidence. It cited her background, her financial debts, and her lack of credentials as proof that she was a grifter, preying on a vulnerable family. The petition requested a full psychological evaluation of both Lillian and Julian, and a court-appointed guardian to assess the situation. A guardian, it helpfully suggested, who could be Caroline herself. It was a declaration of total war. She can't win this, Julian raged, pacing his study. It's baseless. It's slander. It's not about winning, Amy said, reading the document with a growing sense of dread. It's about the process, the evaluations, the court dates, the press leaks. She's going to drag you and Lillian through a public hell. She's trying to break you. The true genius of the attack was that it turned all of Amy's successes into liabilities. The fragile trust she had built with Lillian would be pathologized by court-appointed psychiatrists. Julian's renewed efforts to be a father would be painted as a desperate, last-minute attempt to look good for the court. Caroline was using the system itself as her weapon. The preliminary hearing was set. Julian's lawyers were confident, but worried. The judge assigned to your case, Judge Albright, is a stickler for traditional family structures, one of them warned. He may look at Miss Hayes's unconventional role with suspicion. The day of the hearing, the atmosphere in the courthouse was thick with tension. Caroline was there, looking serene and concerned, a portrait of worried devotion. Julian was a stone-faced statue of fury. Lillian, sitting between him and Amy, was pale and silent, her small hands twisting in her lap. Caroline's lawyer was slick and merciless. He presented his case, painting a picture of a troubled child spiraling out of control under the care of a grieving, absent father and his unqualified girlfriend. He called a parade of witnesses, a disgruntled former housekeeper Carolyn had paid off, a teacher from one of Lillian's old schools. It was a brutal, effective character assassination. When it was Amy's turn to be called as a witness, Caroline's lawyer circled her like a shark. Miss Hayes, is it true you have no formal training in child psychology? Yes. Is it true that at the time of your hiring, you were several months behind on your student loan payments? Yes. So, a woman with no credentials and significant financial distress is offered $500,000 to be a companion to a billionaire's child. Would you agree that sounds opportunistic? Objection, Julian's lawyer called out. Sustained. Watch yourself, counselor, the judge warned. But the damage was done. The lawyer continued, relentless, for nearly an hour. He twisted her care into manipulation, her patience into calculation. By the end, Amy felt bruised and exposed. She could see the doubt in the judge's eyes. Finally, Julian's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, we have one final witness. We call Lillian Croft to the stand." A murmur went through the courtroom. Julian started to object, not wanting to put his daughter through this, but Lillian placed a hand on his arm. "It's okay, Dad," she whispered. She walked to the witness stand, a small, composed figure in a simple grey dress. She looked tiny and vulnerable, and for a moment Amy's heart broke for her. Caroline's lawyer looked smug. Cross-examining a 10-year-old would be easy. "Lillian," Julian's lawyer began gently, "can you tell the court a little bit about Miss Hayes?" "Amy's my friend," Lillian said, her voice clear and steady. "And what does she do for you?" "She listens," Lillian said simply. "She taught me that it's okay if things aren't perfect." When it was time for the cross-examination, Caroline's lawyer approached the stand, his smile condescending. "Lillian, you've been through a lot of nannies and tutors, haven't you?" "Yes." "And you didn't like any of them, did you? You made them leave." "They were annoying," Lillian said. "And your father, he's a very busy man, isn't he? He's not home very often." "He's home for dinner now," Lillian said, her voice firm. "Every night." The lawyer shifted tactics. "Lillian, I want to talk about your mother. You miss her very much, don't you?" Lillian nodded, her composure wavering for the first time. "And your aunt, Caroline, she was very close to your mother, wasn't she? She understands what a special, perfect person your mother was." This was the trap. He was aligning Caroline with the sainted memory of Eleanor. Lillian took a deep breath. "My mother wasn't perfect," she said, her voice ringing out in the silent courtroom. Caroline flinched. The lawyer looked confused. "She was brilliant," Lillian continued, looking directly at the judge. "But she was human. She made mistakes. I have proof." She reached into a small bag she had carried with her and pulled out a rolled-up piece of paper. It was the blueprint. With the clerk's help, she unrolled it on the witness stand. "This is my mother's last design," she explained. "And this section, right here." She pointed with a small, steady finger. "The math is wrong. She miscalculated the load distribution. The roof would have collapsed. She would have fixed it. But she didn't have time. It's a mistake. A beautiful, brilliant mistake." She looked up from the blueprint, her gaze sweeping from the judge to her stunned aunt. "My Aunt Carolyn always told me my mother was perfect, and that I had to be perfect too. She said that's what my father expected. But she was wrong. My father doesn't expect me to be perfect. He just expects me to be his daughter." She turned her eyes to Amy. "Amy taught me that. She didn't try to fix me. She just showed me how to fix the blueprint. She had taken her greatest shame and turned it into her greatest strength. She hadn't just defended Amy. She had articulated the entire, complex heart of the matter with a clarity that none of the high-priced lawyers could match." The courtroom was silent. Judge Albright stared at the small girl on the stand, then at the intricate blueprint, then at Caroline Croft, whose mask of serene concern had finally shattered, revealing the raw, ugly ambition beneath. He cleared his throat. "I believe I have heard enough," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "Petition for guardianship is denied, with prejudice." 6 months later, Amy stood on a windy bluff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean in Maine. The air smelled of salt and pine. Beside her, Julian and Lillian studied a set of revised blueprints spread across the hood of their car. "If we adjust the pitch here," Lillian was saying, tapping the paper, "we can incorporate a skylight without compromising the structural integrity. It'll give the studio better morning light." Julian nodded, studying his daughter's calculations. Good. That's good, Lily. Draw it up. Construction on Eleanor's dream house had begun. It was a project for Julian and Lillian, a way to honor the past while building a future. The flawed design had become their shared passion. Amy was no longer an employee. The $500,000 salary sat in a trust, untouched. She had finished her nursing degree and was now working in the pediatric wing of a city hospital. She was still in the Crofts' lives, not as a companion or a handler, but as family. She came for Sunday dinners, helped Lillian with her homework, and sometimes just sat with Julian in the quiet of the evening. Two unlikely friends, bound by the shared experience of saving a child, and in doing so, saving each other. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the foundation of the house, Lillian looked up at Amy. "You know," she said, a rare, small smile on her face, "the acoustics in the great room are going to be terrible. We should have consulted an audio engineer." Amy laughed. "I guess it won't be perfect then." "No," Lillian agreed, looking at her father, who smiled back. "It'll be better. It'll be ours." Amy watched them, father and daughter, bending over the plans together, their heads nearly touching. The problem had never been the defiant outbursts or the shattered glass. The problem had been a blueprint for a life that demanded an impossible perfection. It had taken a waitress from Queens, a woman who understood the beauty in flaws and the strength in imperfection, to finally show them how to draw new lines.